Um, Hello and welcome to the last Monday Majlis of this term. We'll then have a break over Easter and resume with our next Monday Majlis, which will be um, in the first week of May. Um, Today, it's a pleasure to be hosting Dr. Dustin Klinger, who is a British Academy Fellow at Cambridge. And very much a specialist on philosophy, and in fact the course of Arabic philosophy, especially into the what's often called, for want of a better term, the post-classical period, and especially and also someone who does also work um, on logic, which is an even more kind of rarefied area in the study of Arabic philosophy. But it's a real pleasure to have him and to be discussing his new book, Being Another Way. I'll put a link in the chat to the book in a bit so that people can find it. It is also available open. It's open source, isn't it? So people can just download it as well if they want to. So as we normally do, we'll just start off with asking Dustin a few questions, and then we'll continue on to his presentation, and then there'll be time for questions and comments afterwards. So Dustin, welcome to the Monday Majlis. And if I can start off with a question we always ask our guests, which is if you could tell us a bit about your intellectual journey. How did you come to where you are? What was the path that you took, and why did you get interested in these sorts of things?
Thank you very much, Serge, for having me. It's a great honor. My intellectual journey is, well, it all started off when I was an undergraduate. I wanted to study classics, or I did, and I was interested in Plato and Aristotle and reading Greek philosophy. And my tutor at the time, in one tutorial, told me that all of Aristotle was translated into Arabic, which at the age of 2019 or 20, I had no idea about. And I asked him, who is studying all these Arabic Aristotelians? And he said, well, not that many people, because you'd have to learn Arabic, and that's something most people shy away from. And then originally I wanted to do modern philosophy and read Heidegger and these things, which I couldn't do if I switched to classics and Arabic. But I thought I can, always read Heidegger. But if I don't learn Arabic now, I will never do it. So I started learning Arabic and then got interested in Avicenna and Averroes. And then as I was studying Arabic philosophy, I realized there was a whole tradition that was very little studied after the 12th century. And so I went to do my PhD to work, and I was interested in logic and philosophy of language already. And then I went to do my PhD with Khaled Al-Wahab, who had been working on logic and sort of the later period of Arabic philosophy. And so I got deeper and deeper into it, and it kept being interesting because there was a lot of new things to discover. And so that's how I ended up doing what I'm doing now.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting because it's I guess even in that sort of period of your study, things have really developed. So even if I think back to when I was a student, and thinking of doing something in philosophy, and um, I was massively discouraged because I was told I would certainly not get a job at the end of the day, because it's such a marginal kind of area. But I guess one of the big things which has happened is not only are there more people interested in and students coming through, but we just have many more texts available as well. I mean, I'm not just talking about manuscripts, of course, which have always been there, but texts which have been edited, and whether they're in the works of Avicenna, or whether they're works of logic of all sorts. I mean, recently I've seen so many works of logic being published, not necessarily always in the best editions, but
Yeah.
there's a lot coming out. of Khonaji. Of course, Khalid edited one of Khonaji's texts. Others have been also edited, and many others. So it's in some ways it's a good time to be working in this area. There's a sort of growing interest, a certain momentum, and many texts.
Yeah, absolutely. Still, I mean, even for this book, I was had to work with manuscripts in lots
Yeah.
of places, which is slow, and of course you never, read or transcribe a whole manuscript if you're interested in a particular thing. So there's not no kind of holistic knowledge of these texts yet, because yeah, before there are any sort of editions, people don't read them.
Yeah. And I guess partly also, I mean, we do have this issue of sort of the intermittent academic interest, but also um, whereas in certain areas of the philosophical tradition, we still have, what's sometimes called a living tradition of study in seminaries.
Yeah.
Uh, with respect to logic, um, I mean, there's some sort of very standardized school texts which are studied, but there isn't that broader interest in logic and the sort of the really kind of the key debates and so forth. Scholastic study in seminaries around logic tends to be rather straightforward. It's quite instrumental as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so let me ask you, a question that we always do ask our guests, which is, from your experience on this journey, um, are there any bits of advice that you would give to others who might wish to take a similar one or a different one? I'm thinking of advice, of course, for our PhD students, but also for certain colleagues. What's perhaps the one thing that you would ask us to maybe stop and reflect about?
Well, stop and reflect about, well, I've been thinking about of this journey always as if I can, I want to be doing things I'm interested in,
Mm,
um, which I think is a good sort of guiding star. Um, but of course, you never know where you end up with it. I still think there is an incredible importance in studying sort of Islamic intellectual history of this period that remains understudied for all sorts of reasons. And if students are interested in that, I would encourage it. I won't talk about the job market because that's a whole different issue. But I think if you enjoy the research you're doing, then keep going where your interest leads you.
yeah, I mean, I think yeah, you mentioned the dreaded job market, and especially in a context where it's relatively rare to find a job which mentions Arabic Islamic philosophy. It's certainly even rarer to find a job which mentions logic in that context. Um, but also, we have a broader context in which, the humanities is being massively squeezed anyway.
Yeah.
And so, what tends to happen is that if people want to work in this particular area, I guess they could apply for Islamic studies jobs, but they will probably won't be taken seriously because I remember one interview many years ago when I was told what I did wasn't really Islamic studies because it didn't deal with the fundamental texts of Islam.
Yeah.
Uh, or, applying for a job in philosophy or in history, and then you have to deal with this broader question of how do you speak to that discipline and draw upon what you're doing to speak to that discipline, and that can also at times be quite tricky. So it's a tough, you know, area of specialization to really be in for that reason.
Yeah. I mean, what you're saying is I've been always been between departments already as an undergraduate. I wasn't really in classics. I wasn't really in the Oriental studies. And then at Harvard, I was in philosophy and in analytic. but you know, it's always in between disciplines, which I personally think, you know, it's important for people to do that, because I think there's no reason why there should be someone working on Leibniz and Latin in a philosophy department and not someone working on Arabic philosophy and Arabic, you know,
Yeah.
or like these disciplinary boundaries are incredibly arbitrary, and I think often important research is done at the sort of interstices of the institutional framework. And of course, one has to find a way of presenting one's research so it does speak to people who are offering a job, but that's a different kettle of fish.
A job, but also I guess, I mean, I certainly think for the generation of academics coming through, it's not just about the job. I think it's also about how you develop a particular career and how you develop um, a broader kind of sorry, someone's printing something. Um, um, a um, a broader profile. So, you know, of course, nowadays there's so much interest in things like you know, disseminating your work through podcasts or, you know, blogging and doing, you know, I mean, certainly there were people doing a lot more on Twitter before it became a complete cesspool. So, I mean, I think perhaps the pressure to publish has always been there. But I think nowadays there's this greater pressure to try and speak to why what you're doing is relevant and can actually reach a broader audience than just the academics in a particular specialization.
Yeah. Well, I think there are ways in which you don't need to explain people. Well, one thing I wanted to say, I think there are jobs. I'm having a campus visit next week for ancient and Islamic philosophy. So I think there are jobs. Some departments, even in America, are realizing it's all a little bit under the, you know, getting away from the Western canon and kind of and I think that's an important aspect. I mean, there's some of your work is also in that kind of decolonializing the history
Yeah,
of
yeah,
philosophy in a way, and I think that's something that is happening, and I think it's also that sort of larger topic that is something that I think one can communicate to a wider audience, what it means to think about one's intellectual past as, you know, human beings, and how that is done, and why it's important to study this tradition as well, or these traditions.
yeah. In fact, I mean, it's of course in many ways it makes perfect sense because especially if you're kind of locating um, Arabic Islamic thought within this kind of context of European thought. Um, the common roots, of course, help.
Yeah.
But also, you know, the way in which developments in certain kinds of arguments and clusters of debates and questions do tend to have a connection, or certainly have a parallel lives, which are quite easy to speak to. So in that way, it's much easier than perhaps trying to do the more difficult work of, say, bringing Avicenne into conversation with certain Chinese philosophers.
Yeah.
And because of course we're starting off on very different kind of grounds and contexts. So yeah. Um, so let's come now to what we want to discuss. If you could tell us a bit more about how you came to write this particular book and why you were interested in this particular question, and then we'll move on to your presentation.
Well, there's a pretty straightforward story, I think. So when I came to do my PhD, I wanted to work on language and logic and the notion of truth, and I'd been looking at Al-Farabi, and pretty much when I arrived, there was a seminar on the De Interpretatione and the Greek and Arabic commentaries on it, and reading Ammonius and Farabi's commentary. And that immediately, it was a very good seminar. Some of these, sometimes you have like these a few in your career as a student. I think these teaching events that are really eye-opening in some sense, and was co-hosted by Khalid and but two other professors from the philosophy department, and there were mostly graduate students, some undergraduates, but it was a very lively event, and people would discuss in the hallway afterwards, and so that was kind of the beginning when I was thinking about the copula, because in these commentaries there's a lot of discussion about what the word is in a sentence is doing, and so I started following these discussions further and further, and then in the end up to the 16th century, and then that became my dissertation. And at the same time, I was doing a lot of sort of analytic philosophy, sort of history of analytic philosophy, Frege, Russell, and Wittgenstein, and Quine, and for many of these philosophers, the analysis of propositions was a central issue, of course. And so I had both these sort of perspectives on the problem. One was more contemporary, and even had systematic interests in the issue, and then tried to follow what Arabic philosophers were doing. And so this became my dissertation, and then I turned it into a book. It changed quite a bit, but I had a long part on sort of 20th century discussions on the issue, which was all cut out. But yeah, so the book is based on the dissertation with some substantial changes, and yeah, that's how I ended up with this topic.
Okay. And so the discussion of the copula arose out of your interest in this question of truth validity, or just
Well, I had been working on Averroes' commentary on Aristotle's Metaphysics Epsilon before,
yeah.
and then I realized that Averroes was taking a lot from Farabi, and then I was reading Farabi on his ideas about the development of language and how language works, and what truth is, and how, and I found this really interesting. So that was the initial idea to do doctoral work on, and then that kind of developed into this much larger project to look at discussions of the copula, because they have sort of ramifications in all sorts of directions. And yeah, so I still have 2 chapters on Farabi in the book, and I think he was crucial, and he's probably one of the most interesting contributors to the debate, and kind of set the tone for the ensuing tradition. But then, of course, the focus became what happens later in the tradition.
Yeah. No, in fact, I remember, I think one of the first books I ever bought in this area was Fritz's translation of
Yeah,
Farabi, Comment in the De Interpretation. Yeah.
which I still think is an excellent work. And I've also the translation, that really showed me how important it is. I've been working with his translation. I've modified it a little bit, but I thought it was really helpful for me to get sort of into this topic, and his whatever 190-page introduction or so
Absolutely. Very, very
was
well.
really helpful to yeah, to get a start on these questions.
Okay, so shall we discuss the book in a bit more detail then?
Yeah,
Go ahead and um, start the
let's
presentation.
share my screen now.
Yes, please. Yeah,
Can you see that?
that's right. Yeah.
Right. So the idea was to spend 30-40 minutes on just walking you through not the book, but what I want to do is so this is the book here. It came out September last year, and as I think Sajat said, it's open access, so you can just go on the University of California Press website and download it. But if you want a copy, there's a promo code. Gives you 30% off if you want to order a hard copy online. So what I thought I was going to do is three things. One is just talk a little bit briefly about what my sort of larger historical argument is with the book, and then I want to end with giving you just the chapter summary so you have an idea of what's happening in the book. And the middle part, I want to spend a little bit of time trying to explain to you what the issue is and why looking at these discussions on the copula is interesting, and why it became a question and what the sort of issues at stake are, and why I think that these discussions contributed to what I think was a turn to thinking about questions that we today would classify as pertaining to philosophy of language, especially then in the 14th and 15th centuries. So let me start talking a little bit about the historical argument. As most of you, I think, will be aware of, there was this idea for a long time that there was a golden age of Islamic science and philosophy that ended around 1200. And there's a general idea, especially in philosophy, that when Al-Ghazali wrote the Tahafud al-Falasifa, that afterwards the study of logic became prohibited. There was no serious philosophical engagement. People just reverted to writing commentaries that are unoriginal and kind of just regurgitate older texts. And of course, that all these things are not true. We've many people in the field, of course, agree now. But we still have this period from about 1200 to really the beginning of the 19th century in some sense, where there's a lot of unstudied works that are philosophical by a more rigid or a broader definition, whatever you want to call it, but that need to be studied in order to see how interesting they are. And so what the book does is that it looks at these philosophers that are usually called sort of the classical period, beginning does the whole thing from late antiquity to the Greco-Arabic translation movement, but looking at Farabi, Avicenna, Averroes I took out, but it was in the dissertation. But to look at this as a period of appropriation of Greek philosophy and kind of naturalization within its new context, and then look at the later period from 1200 to 1500 in the book. But there's, of course, it could go on further, but there needed to be an end at some point, to see what happens there. And the overall argument is that there's a lot of people, especially now I've been looking mainly at writings on logic, but there's a lot of people who discuss questions about the copula, but all sorts of other things as well, up to the 16th century. And the overall, I think, development is that there's an increasing emancipation from the Aristotelian roots in logic or philosophy more generally. And I think around the 14th century, in what I call philosophy of language, I think there's something new starting that has to do not only with, of course, Aristotelian, Avicennan logic and more specifically, but with all sorts of other Islamic scientific disciplines that influence each other and lead to a sustained engagement with questions of philosophy of language. That's, for example, how do words mean? What's the relationship between words, our thoughts, and the world? What's the nature of judgment? What's the nature of truth? How do these notions go together? And so these are questions that become discussed with increasing attention and sophistication, I argue, in the book. So the overall argument really is to say, and that, I mean, there have been, I don't know whether people know this article by Dimitri Guterres, it's called a history of science approach, where he says that, well, really what happens after Avicenna is all para-philosophy. It pretends to be philosophy, but what it does is only, prove preconceived notions by philosophical means. And the purpose of the book was that to say that, well, there are certain areas where that really doesn't apply, because there's no preconceived notions in this area of logic or semantics or philosophy of language that need to be kept in place. It's rather the opposite. What we see is that in the 14th century, people start realizing that a lot of what the earlier doctrines on the copula were actually just a little silly, because they took Aristotle too seriously and thought, what Aristotle said must somehow be true, but actually we should think about how the Arabic language works and how it relates to the logical structure of statements. And we don't need these doctrines that really come from late antiquity, from within the Greek context. So this is the larger argument, is to say, well, there is, at least this is an example where there's an area of philosophy that thrives and that's innovative and that doesn't have anything to do with it makes no sense to call this paraphilosophy, basically. So much for the sort of larger argument, and why studying this period in philosophy is important. So this is the table of contents of the book, and as you see, it falls into two parts. As I said, one is really the appropriation of the Greek heritage, which here ends with Avicenna, or with, continues in Al-Andalus with Averroes and even Berger and even later than that. But what in the Islamic East, what happens there is, I think, is sort of a new start, and that's the way that historiographers like Ibn Khaldun, that's how they sort of depict developments in the rational sciences, and I think that's also what we see. So what I want to do is try to explain a little bit what the problem with the copula is and why it matters. And I've got some slides. I hope I can be clear about this, and I don't know whether everyone knows Arabic here, but so just let me try to explain what the problem is, why it matters, and why it makes sense to look at these discussions, also to make an historical argument. So first of all, what is the copula? What is a copula? So a copula is a word that links the predicate and the subject in a sentence. So if you say Socrates is wise, is would be the copula. Now, why these discussions arose is that there was a mismatch between what was being translated from the Greek tradition, from Aristotle and all the commentators, and from sort of the Arabic-speaking translators and philosophers, what they had in terms of intuitions about their own language. So the crucial point is that in Greek, for example, you need a copula as well, just as you do in English. So you would say, ho Socrates sophos esti, or esti sophos. And in Aristotle's texts in logic, sometimes the word esti, the copula, matters for logical analysis. So commentators write about it, and when the Arabic translators are faced with this, they of course have no problem to translate sentences that contain a copula, because you can just express in Arabic, which doesn't use a copula, you can just express them without it. But when the role of the word is or esti is being discussed, they start forging neologisms or new expressions to be able to talk about this word, and they start thinking about what the semantic role of this word is, what it's doing in a sentence, and why it's important. So yeah, so the important point is that their intuition was, because in present tense statements in Arabic you don't use a copula, you just say Sukrat Hakim, that there was something that the Arabic language was deficient in, for those Aristotelian philosophers who thought Aristotle's logic was right and as good as it can get. And so they started thinking about these things. Now, there's a larger, if you look at the problem from a modern point of view, there's a larger issue in the history of logic, because Aristotle's logic is a term logic. For Aristotle's logic, you need to have a subject and a predicate connected by a copula in such a way that they're both terms, so Socrates and wise, and are both referred to by names, basically. And the important thing is that they need to be interchangeable. So they are somehow homogeneous. They're of the same nature. You can switch them around in a sentence. And why is that so? Well, in Aristotelian syllogistic, any subject has to be able to move into the predicate place and the other way around, because all first figure syllogisms require that for a deduction. If you say all humans are mortal, you need to say in the minor premise all professors are humans, so the humans switches position to then get all professors are mortal, which sadly is not only a valid but a sound argument. But the problem with this is that in the history of logic overall, that this idea that subject and predicate can just switch around was seen as one of the most egregious mistakes in the history of logic, because it seemed to not heed the fact that once you exchange a term from predicate to subject position, it undergoes a change of sense in some way. And so what modern linguistics and modern logic since Frege really assumes as an analysis of sentences is that they fall into two heterogeneous parts. So there's a nominal phrase and a verbal phrase. So Socrates is a noun and names an object, and the verbal phrase names a concept, or and includes the word is, so that is no longer a copula connecting the two, but it's a verbal phrase forming operator, let's say. So it's part of the predicate. It's always part of the predicate, and in that sense you can't switch them around. You can't say is wise Socrates. It's just doesn't mean anything. And so this was, of course, what Frege's great achievement was, when he thought that the analysis of proposition is best, expressed, or the form of a proposition is best expressed in a mathematical function where there are two parts that are heterogeneous, that are distinct and cannot be exchanged, and one is unsaturated. So the function of needs an argument for it to spit out a value, the true or the false, but you can't exchange them. And it has been argued that this sort of revolutionary innovation in the history of logic ultimately explained why the predicate calculus developed on the basis of it is so much more successful than, or so much more powerful than Aristotelian syllogistic could ever be, because it can express everything that Aristotelian syllogistic can, but not the other way around. Now, this is the overall sort of idea in the history of logic. And what does this have to do with the Arabic philosophers? Well, Aristotle, in his syllogistic in the prior analytics, assumes the term logic sort of syntactic tree. But in the De Interpretatione, he really describes propositions in the way I showed you with a nominal phrase and a verbal phrase, and the two being heterogeneous and not interchangeable. Now, there's of course a big question of how the texts of the Aristotelian organon relate to each other, and whether they were ever meant to be put together as a whole, which I doubt, because many of them don't presuppose any of the other texts, and the De Interpretatione, in some sense, is in tension with the prior analytics, which is something that the ancient commentators from Alexander or even earlier noticed, of course, but because they thought the organon was supposed to be a unified whole, they tried to make sense of these tensions. And this is, I think, how the question of the role of the copula arose, because for Aristotle himself, it doesn't seem to be an issue. He sometimes talks about there are some passages which seem to be contradictory at times, but it wasn't an issue that he himself ever addressed. It becomes an issue when the ancient commentators up to late antiquity try to make sense of these seemingly contradictory passages in Aristotle. And this, of course, are the texts that the early Arabic philosophers had at their disposal. And they were being translated and used to explain Aristotle. And I think it is through this material that in the early Arabic philosophers, the question becomes important. So what do the Arabic philosophers do? I think they try to synthesize these two and come up with a hybrid. Of course, they don't draw these syntactic trees, but I think their idea is a hybrid one between the noun a verbal phrase analysis from the De Interpretatione and the term logic analysis from the prior analytics. And what they think is that there is a naming word and a statement word, which I translated it. They usually say ism and kalima. Kalima doesn't mean verb, just means word, but it's generally thought to be a word that somehow includes the signification the copula normally has. And any statement word can therefore conceptually be separated into a naming word and a copula, right? So, but the deep structure, I think, for them, even though they insist that there's what the copula normally signifies in Greek, or in Arabic if you create an artificial one, this relation between subject and predicate is irreducible in analysis, but still on the syntactic deep level for them, there's heterogeneity between the subject and the predicate, because the predicate mostly includes the signification that it is related to a subject, if that makes sense. So let me try to explain that a little further. I say mostly because what Farabi comes up with, and which becomes influential all throughout the tradition, is this idea that based on Arabic grammar. So in Arabic grammar, as most of you will know, there are usually you have 3 root letters for any vocable that you have. So for example, hakama. And from these 3 root letters, you can build or derive all other forms to do with this root that has a basic semantic sort of spectrum, and then you can derive all sorts of semantic variations, making it causative as a verb, or making it reflexive, or making it a place noun, or all these sorts of things. And what Arabic grammarians distinguish is the masdar, so the root form of a vocable, and the ism mushtaq, the derived noun, or not, doesn't even have to be a noun, but the derived a word. And what Farabi says, only the masdar form of words is such that it doesn't include the signification that a copula has, so that it is connected to or related to a subject. Only those, and these are very few words, just in terms of numbers, vocables in Arabic, and all other words that are derived, they include the signification of the copula. So they have a clear sense of heterogeneity, that there are certain words that signify attributes and certain words that signify substances. So that is the general idea that Arabic early philosophers came up with. Now, how does that raise questions in philosophy of language? So the idea is, and this is basically the Aristotelian rudimentary theory of meaning, you may have, signs in writing, they somehow signify spoken words or utterances, and they somehow signify concepts in the mind. And only these concepts in the mind refer to things in the world outside. So what I've done here is, you have in the world outside, you have wise Socrates with the glasses on because he's so wise. And it is clear for these early philosophers that the writing is different in all languages. And the utterances or the spoken sounds also differ across languages. The things in the outside world are, of course, the same for all people, no matter what language they speak. Now, what they start thinking about is, well, the concepts in our mind that our words signify might be different depending on our language. So whereas Greeks think about Socrates and wise in a way that it doesn't go together, but needs a copula to connect them. In Arabic, Hakim would be one of the asma mushtaqat, the derived words. The concept of Hakim, as opposed to the concept of Sophos, has somehow a different form. So the concepts in the mind may be different depending on what language someone who thinks of that concept speaks. It's not that there's an entirely different idea of wisdom, and this is a total sort of linguistic relativism or Sapir-Whorf kind of, but the idea is that the concepts might have different forms or accidents or attributes in our mind, depending on the language that we speak. So I think this is how questions in philosophy of mind also, but in philosophy of language arise for them, thinking about the role of the copula in a sentence and in logic more generally. Now, so much for the problem. I hope that sort of I try to illustrate a little bit what I think the underlying issue is that informs these discussions that these scholars are having. What I want to do now to finish, just give you a short overview of the 8 chapters of the book, and I hope it makes more sense now after understanding the problem of the copula a little bit, to understand what's happening. So chapter 1 really is setting the scene. It's looking at Aristotle and the ancient commentators. I showed you the commentators on the De Interpretatione. We only have 4 extant commentaries, but we can reconstruct some of the others from those. And the point is to show what Aristotle's doing, what he's not doing, and how in the ancient commentators, the Greek commentators, the problem of the copula arises as a philosophical question. So in chapter 1, a close reading of Aristotle's De Interpretatione 2-3 provides the Greek background to the Arabic appropriation of the problem of predication. The chapter shows how the question of the semantic role of the copula first emerged when Aristotle's Greek commentators, who attempted a coherent interpretation of the organon, were forced to make sense of apparently contradictory passages on the role of the word is in predication. So this is the background. And chapter 2 and 3 are on Farabi, and chapter 2 doesn't really talk about the copula at all. I felt I needed it to give a broader background what the sort of cultural translation of these works of Aristotle meant, and how to explain how Farabi saw himself as a philosopher who somehow wants to naturalize and integrate Aristotelian philosophy in his own society. So chapter 2 supplies the historical background to the translation and appropriation of the Greek tradition by the first Arabic philosophers. Historical circumstances required Farabi to make Greek logic understandable and palatable to a hypercritical audience that insisted that the sole route to knowledge and understanding was Arabic grammar. So we have an account of a debate between Abu Bishr al-Matar and as-Sidafi, a logician and a grammarian, both famous at the time, who were asked by Ibn Fuwad, the vizier, to debate the relative use or legitimacy of truth claims of both disciplines, and the logician loses and is made to look like a fool. That's of course a literary, so it's an adab piece, but I do think there was serious resistance, and for good reasons, because people said, why do you think we should learn logic, Greek logic, which was developed from within Greek and doesn't really apply to our language and the way we. So there's also this idea that there's concepts in the mind depend on the language in which they are formed. So there's this. So what Farabi needs to do to claim that logic, Aristotelian logic, is universally valid, he comes up with a whole theory of the development of language and how language works that allows him to do that. And I think he conceived of his own philosophical project as being concerned with disambiguating language by studying utterances insofar as they signify meanings. And he thinks, and that's I think why for Farabi the De Interpretatione is so important, that he thinks that this is especially what the De Interpretatione does, disambiguating meanings and thinking about how language works, really. Now, chapter 3 then looks at Farabi's theories about the analysis of propositions in his commentary on the De Interpretatione, applying the theory of etymological word formation from Arabic grammar. This is what I explained, the idea of al-asma al-mushtaka. Farabi stipulates syntactic rules based on a type of heterogeneity between nouns that are etymologically derived and nouns that are not. Further, he holds that categorical statements need a copula, even though Arabic normally doesn't use one. And for lack of an Arabic word, he advises to use mawjood, which literally means is found, contrary to its grammatical form, because it's a derived word as well. Farabi considered mawjood a logical particle signifying a second-order concept, namely that of a predicative function. So he already has a very sophisticated idea of what the copula is doing, and a lot of what he says is then lost later. But this idea that derived nouns include the signification of a link to the subject becomes remains unchallenged in the later tradition. Chapter 4 is on Avicenna and how he deals with Farabi's or responds to Farabi's theory of derived words as including the signification of a copula. But then in his later work, there's no reference to any of it. And there are two passages that seem to be contradictory and that Fakhruddin Razi later will then use to delve into his own discussions. Chapter 5 is about this ideas of Fakhruddin Razi, because Razi says that Avicenna is wrong to say that Avicenna doesn't use mawjood, he uses huwa as a copula. And Razi says that's wrong because in these derived names, this is already included, co-signified by the derived name. Now, Khunaji then criticizes Razi and says these are actually two different things. Huwa is needed as a copula, whereas what is included in the signification of a derived name is a different meaning. So the idea is that you still need to use an artificial copula. And these two positions become discussed later on. So the 6th chapter is about the Marara generation of logicians, and it charts how Razi's and Khunaji's critical attitude shaped a scholarly praxis among a group of logicians connected to the Marara observatory that led to a dramatic increase in the output of logical works. So this is a period most of which falls after the fall of Baghdad, where we see an increase in the production of logical works. And all of these authors join into these discussions on the copula and discuss them in new contexts as the logic of modality develops, and they try to find new conversion rules for the new modalities. They think about the copula in these contexts. I'm about to finish. The 7th chapter then also makes a sort of historical argument, because Shamsuddin as-Samarkandi, of course, was the first to include his theory of adab al-bath or formal disputation in a work on logic, and it's closely intertwined with the developments in propositional logic. So this is one thing, that logical texts become written in a clearly in the style of formal disputation that has been developing as a theory. And that is also to show that, like Samarkandi, for example, wrote an auto-commentary on his own work to show that these commentaries in that period are really not didactic commentaries to explain a base text, but they are ways of deepening philosophical questions and rigorously, considering arguments and counter-arguments of real or imagined objectives. So these great dialectic commentaries, I think, should be seen as a genre in which these scholars were doing not school science, but research science. They were trying to advanced logic just in this form of commentary that usually people would think is not just because of its genre original. But all these authors also contribute to the questions on the copula, and what starts to happen then is that people realize, well, maybe it's the inflectional signs in Arabic, because you say, of course, Sukrat hakimun, right? And maybe it's just the inflectional signs that play the role of the copula, and we don't need any of these Greek theories. And Qutbuddin Arazi al-Tahtani is the first to say, well, he formulates what I call the notion of unsaturatedness, because I think that's what it is. It's not the same as Frege, but he says that predicates are always in need of a subject for the sentence to become unified and become such that truth or falsehood applies to it. And then the last chapter is trying to make sense of developments in neighboring disciplines like Balagha and the new science, which is called Ilm al-Wada, which is I'd call it a fundamental science of fundamental semantics. It's asking questions of how God must have devised language for it to work as well as it does. It's not confined to the Arabic language, although it's done for the Arabic language, but it's really about how words sort of can mean certain things, and these two traditions, I think, become merged in the logical works of especially Sayyid Sharif al-Jurjani. And he comes up with so he and Taftazani, they both reject all these theories that are remnants from the Greek commentators on Aristotle that we had in Farabi and Avicenna and later on. And they come up with an entirely new account, which is mainly based in the new theories from Ilm al-Wada, that will take too long to now fully explain, but they have nothing to do anymore with the, I think what's important, they have nothing to do anymore with sort of the Greek background, and they work for especially well for Arabic and to explain how the Arabic language works. And then there's a short look ahead to the Mughal tradition, and Dawani is someone who tries to recover sort of the Avicennan position, and that has some influence. But in general, in works on logic in the Mughal Empire in the 16th century, 17th century, and up to the 18th century, I think there's a long section at the very beginning of logical works that discusses exactly that issue, and how the notion of the copula and the connection between subject and predicate connects to the notion of judgment and what the relation between the two of them. So these discussions continue, and they would probably, if one looked at the Ottoman Empire and at other areas, one would find continuations of these discussions as well. So this just to say that this doesn't end at a point. I think it continues up to the beginning of the 19th century, and there's always new ideas being discussed. It's for most of the sources that I looked at, this is an productive engagement, and it's not regurgitating the positions of not only regurgitating the positions of previous scholars. So this is sort of an overview of what happens in the book. There's of course much more in there, but I hope that this has given you an idea of what the story is. And I'll stop here, and I'm happy to take questions.
Well, thank you, Dustin. Yes, I think that's raised lots of questions. So I'm going to open up the floor. Let me just stop recording first. 1 second. Where is it?